Primary polydipsia, also known as psychogenic polydipsia or as compulsive water drinking, is currently considered to be a mental health condition in which patients drink large volumes of water in the absence of physiological need and just because they are mentally ill. In other words, it is assumed that patients are drinking 6, 8, 10, 14 or even 20 liters of water per day, not because they have any biomedical need to do so, but simply because of being stuck in some sort of strange mental compulsion to down as much water as possible. Drinking so much water is very dangerous, of course, and some so-called primary polydipsia patients can develop cerebral swelling along with life-changing complications, and some patients can die. The risk of fatality and of serious complications stem from the development of hyponatremia, i.e. low blood sodium levels. Indeed, the key clinical features of primary polydipsia are hyponatremia, dilute urine, and, at least according to the patient, excessive thirst. Primary polydipsia is generally diagnosed by using the water deprivation test. Patients are prohibited from drinking water for an extended period of time. If this total water restriction leads to the patient producing concentrated urine, then this is taken as evidence that vasopressin function is intact. If vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, can work, then the body was always capable of conserving water in a normal way. And if that is the case, then, or so the thinking goes, there was never any need to have been drinking so much water in the first place. Therefore, the patient had no biomedical reason for drinking so much, and the only possible explanation for their behavior must be mental illness. But are these patients actually mentally ill? Does it really make sense, on the face of it, that someone drinking 20 liters of water in a day and who says that they are dying of thirst, and in some cases actually do pass away, that person is just mentally ill? What if they really are suffering from a biomedical thirst? And what if the idea that this disorder has been caused by mental illness is actually a terrible mistake? I believe that it is a mistake, so much so that I have written a medical hypothesis to make my case. The myth of primary polydipsia, why hypovolemic dehydration can explain the real physiological basis of so-called psychogenic water drinking. The book is available on Amazon, or as a free PDF download from its website, themythofprimarypolydipsia.com. You can find links in the description box below, as well as my own bio. But what is my argument, put in the simplest possible way? What is hypovolemic dehydration, and how can it explain, in biomedical terms, the typical clinical features of psychogenic water drinking, or what has been assumed to be psychogenic water drinking, at least? First, some basics. The brain actually has two thirst centers, osmotic and hypovolemic. These are situated separately and have different physiological roles. The osmotic thirst center is triggered when the body's water content is too low. This is the only kind of thirst that most healthy people will ever experience. The hypovolemic thirst center, meanwhile, is triggered when the body's blood volume is too low. Indeed, hypovolemia is simply the medical term for low blood volume. This thirst center is triggered when the plasma blood volume drops by 10%. Unlike the osmotic thirst center, the hypovolemic thirst center requires appropriately concentrated, i.e. salty fluid, in order to be quenched. Drinking pure water alone can never satisfy hypovolemic thirst. This is because it is the prerogative of the kidneys to filter that water out. Blood is salty stuff after all, and in order to boost blood volume, some kind of salty solution will be required. Okay, with that out of the way, how can this information help to explain so-called primary polydipsia in a new light? Imagine the following model. Let's say someone has a chronic illness, that causes a significant reduction in plasma blood volume. Indeed, by more than the 10% that is needed to trigger the hypovolemic thirst center. And imagine that that same chronic illness has pathophysiological mechanisms by which that low blood volume cannot then be corrected by the body. Instead, that low blood volume remains as an ongoing state. What kind of pathophysiological mechanisms are we talking about? What kind of mechanisms could create a state of ongoing low blood volume? Well, salt levels in the body are controlled by a hormonal network known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, RAAS. In a healthy person, this system works to conserve salt levels. But let us assume, for the sake of our model, that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is not working properly, that it is instead blunted, suppressed, downregulated, and that, as a result, the patient loses excessive salt in their urine. This will lead over time to a state of low blood volume, and because the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is suppressed, that state of low blood volume will remain. This, of course, goes against standard textbook teaching, which states that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system will upregulate in order to increase blood levels when necessary. Let's now consider how all of this could create a kind of polydipsia. I suggest that the sequence of events is the following: renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system suppression, leading to salt and solute loss and the creation of low blood volume over time. This low blood volume cannot be corrected due to the very same renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system suppression. The hypovolemic thirst center activates when the plasma volume has reduced by 10%. The patient makes the understandable mistake of just drinking pure water in response to their thirst. That water is urinated out, the blood volume remains low, and therefore the hypovolemic thirst center continues to be triggered. As a result, the patient enters a vicious cycle of polydipsia. The understandable mistake of the patient is crucial to this dynamic. We need to remember that the hypovolemic thirst center is not looking for the patient to drink water. That simply won't work. But what will the patient do? What would any patient do? Who, when they are feeling thirsty, does not assume that their body wants them to drink water? But this can never be effective when low blood volume is the origin of that thirst. This model can explain all of the key clinical features of what is currently assumed to be psychogenic water drinking. The thirst is unquenchable because the wrong remedy is being applied to the problem. The urine is dilute because of how much water is consumed. The hyponatremia develops for two reasons. First, through dilution of the bloodstream due to the amount of fluid consumed, but secondly, and more importantly, it develops because of the salt loss that is caused by the downregulation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The fact that the hyponatremia could develop because of this organic reason would add evidence to the hypothesis that this condition is biomedical and not psychological. So there you have it. An organic model to explain the same typical clinical picture and symptom presentation that is observed in so-called psychogenic water drinkers. This model also shows us why the water deprivation test is inadequate, irrelevant even. It can only test vasopressin function. Even if vasopressin function is shown to be intact, this tells us nothing about the function of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system or about that patient's current blood volume status. It is the equivalent of examining a patient's elbow, finding it to be unbroken, and declaring that all is well, while that patient is actually suffering from a broken leg and screaming in agony. The water deprivation test simply cannot find the real problem. But for this model to make sense, there needs to exist a patient population to whom it can obviously apply. And indeed, there does. Patients with POTS, Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia syndrome, and ME, Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, are often excessively thirsty. And in both of these chronic health conditions, low blood volume is regarded as central to the illness. In fact, in both conditions, a strong suppression of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system has been observed. Termed the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone paradox by researchers, this phenomenon goes against the above-mentioned standard textbook teaching that the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system will upregulate it when needed to conserve salt or boost blood volume. The reasons for this suppression are beyond the scope of this talk, but I delve into them in detail in my book. The upshot is that something quite physiologically catastrophic is happening in these conditions. For example, in myalgic encephalomyelitis, research has shown that patients can even be a whole litre or more short of total blood volume. That means that these patients have around 4 litres of blood rather than 5. This creates many of the condition's core symptoms, including, of course, thirst. In fact, researchers in these conditions have long noted that these patients are often very thirsty. And indeed, the clinical presentation is one of dilute urine, unquenchable thirst, and a tendency towards developing hyponatremia, just like in so-called primary polydipsia. This begs the question, has it been ME and POTS patients who have been all along historically misdiagnosed as psychogenic water drinkers? I believe so. When you go back to the early research into so-called psychogenic water drinking, such as the 1959 paper by Barlow and de Wardener, you actually sense that the patients in question were really myalgic encephalomyelitis and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome patients. That 1959 paper, titled Compulsive Water Drinking, examined the case studies of 9 patients. Their symptoms were typical of ME and POTS and included aching everywhere, breathlessness on exertion, and severe weakness of the legs. Their health issues also started following other severe illnesses or acute stressors, and this is typical of the development of ME and of POTS. That 1959 paper is interesting for another reason. It outright states that primary polydipsia patients have their disorder simply because of being emotionally disturbed. It insinuates that the patients developed their compulsion to drink large volumes of water because of troubled childhoods, not having enough sex, conversion disorders, delusional hypochondriasis, and yes, you probably guessed it, female hysteria. So much for the scientific method in action. These were all Freudian ideas that were in vogue at the time, but which are more typically rejected today. Why is it important to point out the Freudian origins of primary polydipsia? Because, as Professor Daniel Bichet of the University of Montreal wrote in 2017, our understanding of the pathophysiology of this disease has made little progress since Barlow and de Wardener's paper. Indeed, I would say that the understanding has hardly advanced at all, and nor have many efforts been made to advance that understanding. A lifetime PubMed search of psychogenic polydipsia will yield less than 300 results, while by way of contrast, a lifetime search for multiple sclerosis will return over 100,000 results. It simply hasn't been top of the medical priority list to understand why these patients suffer so terribly, even though it is recognized as a potentially fatal condition. Professor Daniel Bichet goes even further, saying, "The diagnosis of compulsive water drinking must be made with care and may represent our ignorance of yet undescribed pathophysiological mechanisms." I believe that this is correct. I am not suggesting that hypovolemic thirst is the only explanation for what might represent a biomedical theory for what has been called psychogenic polydipsia. There could, of course, exist others, and in actual fact, some people do drink too much water purely for psychogenic reasons, although these people, crucially, do not report thirst as a motivator. Even within ME and POTS, low blood volume is likely not the only reason for excessive thirst. Mast cell activation issues, inflammatory responses, and neurological dysregulation might all play a role. But the low blood volume is likely to be the big reason. Hypovolemia is physiologically catastrophic, and extreme thirst will be one consequence of it. Perhaps one day it will be shown that the only craziness in this whole debacle of so-called psychogenic water drinking was to assume that patients who were drinking so much water, even to the point of death, were doing so because of mental illness and not because of a devastating organic pathology. Indeed, if a patient says that they are dying of thirst, then you should probably believe them. This video has only presented the hypothesis in the simplest terms. My book goes into detail about the early history of research into this condition, the pathophysiology of low blood volume in ME and POTS, many patient testimonies regarding this symptom, as well as treatment options. The book also makes connections with long COVID, an illness that is considered very similar to ME and POTS, and in which many patients also suffer from increased thirst. To read the whole book, available either as a paperback from Amazon or as a free PDF download, please follow the links in the description box below. I welcome any correspondence or collaboration on the ideas in my book. There is a contact form on its website. Thank you for watching.